Well, thank you for your patience. We're delighted that you're all here. It's so nice for me personally to see so many former students and friends. We've got a terrific event for you this afternoon to kick off reunion weekend. It's a panel on deglobalization, decarbonization, and trade. And the interesting question, I think, is what is happening in these areas? Why is it happening, and what can be done about it? And I think also, and I hope we'll get to this in our discussion, who will lead, who will be benefited, who will be hurt by the combination of these forces. I wanted to just set the table a little bit, and then we'll get right to our panel, by defining some of the terms in the title of this panel. The first one is decarbonization. And of course, it should be relating to greenhouse gases broadly, and we can think about sustainability broadly, but this is the leading example, I think, in our time of a global regulatory project. And it's interesting to think, how will that be done? What will be the dynamics of this cooperation, of solving this collective action problem, with great debates about how states should contribute to its resolution. Trade, the second topic, or the third topic in the title, is now quite different from what it was 40 or 50 years ago. It has a very large digital component, both in services and in goods. And that changes a lot, including issues of cybersecurity and privacy and so on. And then the tough word in our title is deglobalization. And in a sense, it's a red herring because it's not really happening in the broadest sense yet. There's a slowing of globalization. The United States, I think, has deglobalized to some important extent, but the world still has a great deal of global commerce. And that global commerce gives rise in part to the demand for regulation of things like climate change. But deglobalization comes because of concerns about economic inequality, disappointment, due largely to non-trade causes, but trade is often scapegoated for some of those problems. There are enormous security challenges. And I think 50 years ago, we would not have said that security was a main problem for trade, but today it is. It's a central problem for trade, both in the sense of cybersecurity, but also in the sense of concerns about what they now call geoeconomics, the concern about arming your opponent with robotics or artificial intelligence. And then decarbonization itself is a reason for deglobalization, to the extent you have barriers to trade that come because of concerns about carbon, about global warming, and things like the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism is an example of that. So we have changing globalization. And for this school, I think it's an indicator of changing diplomacy. And one of the things that I've noticed as we've proceeded is the increasing concern of diplomacy with very specialized technical issues like carbon, like security, like taxation, that haven't been at the center before. So we have a kind of multifunctional diplomacy and questions about how to manage that. So I'm looking forward to hearing from a wonderful panel with a current Minister of Foreign Affairs, a former Minister of Trade. The Minister of Foreign Affairs is Minister Haavisto, a former Minister of Trade, Minister Valenciano, a future Prime Minister, Mihaela Papa, and me, who will never be a minister. So with that, let me introduce Minister Haavisto.
Thank you, Joel, for your opening words, and great to be here. And sorry, it's my fault that we are running a little bit late because of the air connections. And nice to be here with both Mihaela and Andrés. Extremely interesting debate, and good to be at Fletcher School. And of course, first, when we look the path towards the green transition in Finland, my own country, one of the Nordic countries, actually we set this government that I'm a member of, set the goal at 2019 to be a carbon neutral country 2035. And that was a little bit more ambitious goal than what some other, or what European Union and some other European countries adopted. So we have been some kind of forerunner on our national goal. And of course, the main goal was to tackle the climate crisis. But now we are in an interesting double challenging situation, because we have in our vicinity, of course, the Russian attack against Ukraine. It also gave us an additional reason to reduce our dependency on Russia, reduce our dependency on fossil fuels. And all this, what has happened, is accelerating the green transition very much, not only in Finland, but also in the whole European Union. People are saying that what was planning to do happening in the next 50 years is now happening maybe during the next 5 or 10 years. And let's see how this is working, because of course we know that investments to energy infrastructure are long-term investments and not easy to do in 1 or 2 years, but the will is very strong there, and the whole European Union united of decreasing the dependency on Russian fossil fuels. And I have to also say that the European Union has been showing a very unique unity. We are a fighting team usually with the 27 members, and we have a lot of opinions, a lot of views, different policies, different political parties, from the right wing to the left parties and so forth, and all the time elections ongoing. So sometimes it's extremely difficult to find a consensus. But on this green transition and our support to Ukraine, we really have found a common tone. And I have to say that I'm very proud of European Union as such. One issue that's what I'm always mentioning is that when I'm sitting with the EU ministers, we speak about the lethal support to Ukraine. How do we send more arms? When I'm sitting in the NATO ministerial roundtable, we speak about the non-lethal aid to Ukraine. And I don't know how it's like that, but that's the truth. So NATO, of course, concentrates to defend its own territory, but European Union tries to have, of course, influence what's happening in Ukraine and what's happening in Ukrainians' fight against the Russians. And of course, what we did nationally was diversifying our gas sources. We went very rapidly to the LNG sources. We are buying also from the US. We made a LNG harbor in half a year time, and because the pipeline from Russia was cut from Russian side. And also, of course, we immediately also reduced our other dependencies on fossil fuels. You know, we are living in a country that had 800 miles common border with Russia. So whatever happening in Russia is always also influencing to us. And as you probably know, last spring, when the Russian attacked Ukraine and the war began, the attitude on the NATO membership changed in one night. In Finland, we were outside of NATO, like Sweden, and then one night, actually majority of the Finns decided that now it's time to join the NATO, and we were running this process last spring, this summer and the autumn, and finally, actually this spring, we got the last ratifications from Turkey and from Hungary. And we still hope that our neighbor Sweden will get the last ratifications as soon as possible, hopefully before the Vilnius summit in the coming summer. On investments to renewables, I think the common thinking always has been in Finland that if you want to invest to renewable sources, you need a lot of state funding, a lot of cheap loans, lot of support and so forth. But when we have been following the recent energy prices, of course, it has become more and more profitable to invest to the renewables, whether it's wind energy, solar energy, geothermic energy, and so forth. And I had a very unique occasion in my ministry when a young group of young investors to wind power came to the ministry and explained that we can invest 6 times more to the wind energy in Finland, what we are doing now, and it will overcome the energy production of our nuclear power plants and so forth in the future. And we can in the future sell green energy to our neighboring countries. And we can, through the hydrogen processes, we can go to the green steel. So we can be one of the leading steel producers, but in a climate-friendly way, and maintain our steel production and so forth. And everything sounded perfect. And I said to these young guys that, what do you need from us politicians? And the answer was, we don't need anything, just keep your fingers out of this business. This is such a lucrative business nowadays. And I had to say that that was the first ever group that came to the ministry to tell that just keep your hands out of this. And that raised a certain optimism in myself. You know, something is moving. If these guys are serious, if these investments are moving, we are really making more rapid change than what we as politicians even could imagine or could dream about. But of course, we know that we need public-private partnership. If we go to the hydrogen economy, we have to have a planning, mapping. We have to have the pipelines on the map. We have to think where the industries are located and how the energy connections are there, how our grid is working, and all these issues. And it's not only, of course, in Finland. We had excellent meeting just with the German and Danish ministers on Baltic Sea offshore wind turbines and how this type of energy production can be at the Baltic Sea shores increasing, how this production can be increased, and also how this grid should work actually so that it's covering all the countries in the Baltic region and so forth. So it's all this, of course, has to be planned carefully, and cities, municipalities have to be involved in this very much. And of course, it needs also certain new thinking from the consumer side as well, that consumers know and can ask green energy and appreciate the production of the green energy. Maybe I only mention one thing, and then I'm very eager to hear my colleagues here, but Finland is also an Arctic country. US is an Arctic country, Canada is an Arctic country, and we have this 8 countries common Arctic Council. I was actually, was it 1997, I was in Ottawa when it was established, and it has 2 very clear goals. One was the sustainable development issue, one was to protect the indigenous people in the Arctic areas, and of course protect the climate and prevent the climate change. And when we are following what's happening in the Arctic areas, we know that the effects of the climate change are very rapid there. Ice is melting, environmental conditions are changing. This has immediate influence to indigenous people as well. But at the same time, also all the security threats around the Arctic are increasing. It's not only Russia who is interested in Arctic, there is China, there is India, and so forth. So this Arctic cooperation among the 8 Arctic countries has been also from that purpose very valuable. And I have to say that it's one of those very few meetings where there's a certain kitchen table atmosphere when you go to the Arctic Council meeting. The last ministerial meeting was, of course, before the Russian attack against Ukraine, I think spring 21 in Reykjavik. Minister Blinken was there, Secretary Blinken was there, Minister Lavrov from Russia was there, and then 5 Nordic countries, Canada, US, and Russia. And then we were sitting and having our dinner together, and we discussed about our hobbies. What are the hobbies? There was a Canadian minister who was astronaut, has a background in the sky, a very amazing hobby. Then the Norwegian minister who was a sky jumper, using parachutes, and lady minister also, oh God, I'm only fixing all cool Volkswagen Beetles, so it's nothing, nothing to compare. But then Minister Lavrov said, sometimes I'm escaping from my security and I'm driving myself to Dacia, to the summer cottage, and my security doesn't know where I am. And then Blinken was looking, what? I cannot even drive my car. I cannot go to car that's driven by my wife. And then, Lavrov smiling very, very widely and said, well, but we live in a free country. So that was the kitchen table atmosphere. And you understand that I'm still missing part of it, because now no communication, of course, for obvious reasons and so forth, but this is what the international community at the best should be and would be, and that's really needed also in the future at the Arctic Council, of course, hopefully after the political changes in Russia. I will finish here. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating set of comments. We'll save the question and answer and discussion for after. Andrés Valenciano, Minister Valenciano, would you speak next, please?
Good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here after almost 11 years now since my graduation from Fletcher. So it's always an amazing experience to be here, especially sitting next to esteemed professors, faculty, and also Fletcher graduates. So thank you, Minister, for your opening presentation. I'm going to try to provide a different angle to present all the discussion about decarbonization and deglobalization. What does it mean for small developing countries around the world, such as Costa Rica? So I want to try to present that perspective to get a more comprehensive picture of what is happening and what are the implications for the policies that are being acted here in the US and in the European Union, particularly the IRA and the Green New Deal, and what does that mean for countries like ours? So as you know, and everyone agrees that the world needs to decarbonize. And it's really inspiring to see that there's climate action happening from leading countries such as the US and the European Union. But if we're talking about a just transition, we also have to pay attention in the way that it's being done. And what are the consequences for other countries? As you can imagine, we definitely need emissions to be reduced, but through initiatives such as the IRA and the Green New Deal, which are very ambitious in scale, which are the type of things and policy decisions that we need, it also comes with a risk of slowing down the energy transition in developing countries. As you can imagine, the challenge that many of our smaller developing middle income countries have is not only to decarbonize, but we also need to develop. That means we also need industrial policies. We need policies that allow the creation of good jobs. And that means that there will be some need for space for a growth in the emissions of those countries. Those energy transition curves have to be very different, cut out depending on where countries are starting and where they're ending. So once the IRA and the Green New Deal were enacted, countries raised their hands asking like, well, does this mean that many developing countries will be cut out of certain critical supply chains because of the nearshoring that is being brought back to both European Union and to the US? Does that mean that some countries which have more muscle, let's say more negotiating power, like South Korea and Japan, were already able to sit on the table with countries and try to look for ways of getting their supply chains, their exporters, to not be cut out of some of the incentives that are being brought by these big deals? But that's definitely not the case for the rest of the world. We've seen some good examples of how countries who were already very open in terms of the free trade agreements, such as the case of Costa Rica, in which for 25 years, 30 years, we've been building a trade platform that includes free trade agreements with over 16 partners, including the US, China, the EU, the UK, Singapore, Korea, and others. We were in a, let's say, a better position to try to take advantage of being connected to those global supply chains. But at the end of the day, what I really want to highlight is that this pressure of developing countries of having to decarbonize, but at the same time diversify their economies to be able to increase the job creations and increase their competitivity is put into a big challenge, especially for countries that are sitting on the deposits of the minerals and the rare earths that the rest of the world needs to decarbonize. So I'll give you an example. As you know, the Amazon basin is one of the lungs of the world in terms of biodiversity, in terms of carbon capture and everything. But also it's sitting on top of reserves of rare earths and minerals that are needed for all the batteries that are needed for the electric mobility transition. So how are we going to provide the investment and the capabilities for those countries to be able to develop those industries in a way that not only helps them create good jobs, but allows them to preserve the environment and preserve also the social contract, for example, with indigenous communities that are present in many of those parts of the world. And that is not only the case for Brazil, you're seeing that in the case of Indonesia, you're seeing that in the Congo Basin. So these are really complex questions that would need to be asked when you're talking about a deglobalization and decarbonization environment. I'll just say that as a small country, and I'll give a couple examples of what Costa Rica has been saying around the need for us to raise our voices and set an example. That's why Costa Rica has been part of many of the discussions at the WTO, at the OECD, for example, at the WTO, where one of the co-chairs of the so-called TESDI, is the Trade and Environment and Sustainability Structured Discussions, which is a good example of what the WTO could potentially do, because as you know, the WTO has been slow in its progress of addressing things like the subsidies that go to agriculture, to fisheries, to fossil fuels. And most recently, as you saw, what I could also call the failure of the WTO to address the crisis around COVID-19. But there's still space for small developing countries to raise the voice and make sure that our perspective is heard in this type of forums. Otherwise, we might have a transition, but probably won't be just, because at the end, just transition means not only where we get, but also it's a process of how we get there. And I would argue that recent concerns that have been raised, for example, around the carbon border adjustment mechanisms that are being in place, rightfully so, I would argue, around the EU to avoid carbon leakage in terms of the standards that they're asking their companies to reach. It also puts additional pressure on the developing countries where those industries are based, because carbon border adjustment mechanisms requires the greening of industries such as steel, iron, cement, which are very complex to do. And it also puts pressure on the tax authorities of those countries. So establishing funds, for example, and this has been discussed, a fund around what the revenues of the CBAM could provide additional funding for developing countries to be able to be part of that energy transition, are examples of things that we can do to help ensure that this is really a just transition and not only a green transition that leaves a lot of countries behind. So I'll stop there, and I'll have an additional comments on some of the things that the minister said, but I'll leave that for my second round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. Minister Haavisto spoke about a common tone inside the European Union. And we can imagine that that common tone comes from all sorts of reasons and experience of working together. Minister Valenciano spoke about some of the difficulties of small states, of developing states, as that common tone in the European Union is expressed and has external effects on other states. And that's what diplomats and international relations are concerned about. Our third speaker is Dr. Papa, please.
Thank you so much. After my initial no pressure introduction from Professor Trachtman, I am only relieved that he didn't say how many years I have to become Prime Minister. So for example, like on your 20th reunion from now, that's it, right? So anyway, or is it maybe like 40th? I need to live a long life. Actually, my former colleague, Andrés Plenković, is Prime Minister in Croatia, my home country right now. So I have to ask him what he thinks about it. First of all, welcome back to Fletcher. It is very exciting and especially emotional weekend for me because it's also my 20th anniversary. And I see some of my old colleagues here. I wish you all a very happy anniversary. When I was at Fletcher, I was actually always with a stroller with my little kid. And that kid is having on Sunday his graduation from Tufts in biology. So thank you. But anyway, before I go all emotional, I need to de-emotionalize because I want to talk to you today about deglobalization and focus on that aspect. So in terms of deglobalization, there are different ways of thinking about it, but ultimately the bottom line is the world less interconnected with greater focus on nation states and border controls, or is it basically less focus on global institutions, treaties, and free movement of goods and services? And as Professor Trachtman mentioned, we are not talking about reversal of globalization. We are talking potentially about slowdown in terms of whether world trade in goods and services as a percentage of global GDP is falling or not. But when we talk about globalization from the perspective of environmental community, and I'm here as environmental faculty, environmental people have always had love and hate relationship with globalization. And that being said, in a way, planetary thinking requires us to think about interconnectedness, but at the same time, globalization creates a lot of environmental problems. But for environmental community, actually, the world has never been more global. We looked at like landmark biodiversity framework, we look at global plastics treaty, so it's kind of like global on fire. At the same time, we know much better how to implement Paris Agreement, which we did not know that well only 2 years ago. At the same time, when we think about sustainable development, which is supposedly helping us get the global grounded into local communities, equity, environment, economic growth, thinking about it in parallel, sustainable development as a universal project and universal paradigm is not doing that well if we look at its final iteration in terms of implementation of sustainable development goals. So that said, here we do see deglobalization forces. At the same time, there is a larger geopolitical question how to innovate for sustainability and to pick up on who is the one to innovate. So at the Fletcher School, I have been leading with our academic dean, Kelly Sims-Gallagher, a project on rising power alliances, looking in particular at the behavior of the BRICS group, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, and looking at to what extent they are the agents of change in the system. So we had a big multi-year Department of Defense Minerva grant and engaged a lot of Fletcher students to look at when and how rising powers ally with one another and actually how they want to change the system and how it impacts the United States. So the deglobalization forces have been evident in the relationship between BRICS and the US and the allies, where sometimes we're wondering, is there like a parallel system of beliefs? There are parallel directions when on the one hand, there's Ukraine and sanctions. On the other hand, there is this belief in the importance of engagement and sanctions. To the extent that now in August, BRICS is planning a big summit in South Africa, and President Putin is supposed to arrive. And if he actually arrives, he would need to be arrested if, given that South Africa is a party to the International Criminal Court and that there is a warrant. So in terms of BRICS, now they are 41% of world population, 24% of world GDP. And their movement to innovate and even integrate is actually quite different. When we look at the EU collaboration was based on trade, and trade was a positive spillover into different areas of collaboration. But when you actually look at BRICS from the self-standing institution until today, trade is one area that has largely been a barrier, and collaboration actually flourished in all other areas. And despite the fact that China spent from the get-go wanting a free trade agreement to today, trade having like the absolute priority on the agenda, and actually very little happened on that front. So here's the question, whether trade is still a connector that it used to be when we are thinking about new integrations. At the same time, there's a question whether we can experiment with different parallel institutions. And especially now when we're thinking about experimentation with different banks. So the new development bank as like a mini World Bank, the contingent reserve arrangement by BRICS as a mini IMF. And there is no mini WTO for now. But what exists is now the new talk about de-dollarization, about BRICS joint currency, which also questions to what extent we are seeing even more deglobalization forces on the one hand, but also new bloc building on the other. So finally, I wanted just to leave two thoughts. Is collective action across blocks possible? So we are looking at block behavior, which actually means that you can't go to the person who produces the cheapest solar panels, but you need to go to the person who has good price solar panels, but at the same time is not a geopolitical risk. So you actually need to think about who your friends are and then who to trade with. But at the same time, the friends are very fragile. So there is a lot of multi-alignment. So who do you even count on? And at the same time, the second point, as the global bargaining space is shrinking, is there actually a feasible opportunity to co-create the system in a way where we can have collective action? And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much, Mihaela, for that perspective. Adding a perspective of history, of changing power structures and new institutions. And I think that's a very important part of this discussion. I wanted to say a few words, maybe from a more theoretical standpoint, about sustainable development and trade. And, you know, I think it's fair to say that before the WTO was created in 1995, they were totally separate. There was environment was kind of invented in the 1960s, but there was environment and there was trade. And a lot of economists, a lot of neoclassical economists at the time, you know, thought that was the right way to do it. We're going to reduce barriers to trade and make more wealth, and we'll work on the environment somewhere else. And then there were public relations problems with that in the early years of the WTO, and they started to talk about win-win solutions. If we reduce agricultural subsidies, as was mentioned, that'll have a beneficial effect for the environment, so we should just do that. And more recently, there has been what I call natural linkage, things like leakage, as has been mentioned. If you have trade and one country reduces its carbon, then maybe, I got too excited, maybe there'll be a movement of industry or trade to another country. And so you have natural linkage, but I think we're in an era where we have to consider what I call constructed linkage, where we recognize that it's important to achieve more things. And as our speakers have suggested, different countries have different needs and different perspectives, and we have to make bargains. And those bargains have to be in the form of what I've started to call diverse reciprocity. So trade liberalization for environmental protection. And we see some of that already, but I think we need more of that. And there is a change that I think is remarkable at the World Trade Organization, really starting with the member states like Finland and Costa Rica and Croatia, maybe the United States as well, to make changes to become more sustainable. And the common tone in the European Union is a leading force. And there's a more robust response from the WTO Secretariat. The Director General, Dr. Ngozi, has been a strong force for sustainability and decarbonization and looking for the role of the World Trade Organization, so rejecting that earlier idea that these things are separate. There's a coalition of trade ministers for climate. That's a remarkable idea. You've got these trade ministers who are working on climate. They want to make sure that this trade system is harnessed to reducing climate change. And the EU and 26 others, including Finland, Costa Rica, and the United States, are in that group. As Andy mentioned, there's the TESD, the Trade and Environmental Sustainability Structured Discussions. I have to look at my notes to remember what it stands for. With 71 co-sponsors, there are slow negotiations about reducing barriers to trade in green goods and maybe green services. Just last year, there was an agreement on IUU fisheries. I think I know what that acronym is. It's illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. So subsidies for those types of fishing. And it's a remarkable thing because it's mostly about sustainability. It's not very much, in my judgment, about trade. And it happened at the World Trade Organization. And it happened, as Santiago Wills, the Colombian ambassador who led those negotiations, said, where he was able to hold up agreement on other more central trade things in order to achieve agreement on the fisheries subsidies arrangement. So that's an example of this diverse reciprocity that I've been speaking of bringing in environmental discussions and making bargains in diverse areas. Right now, there are discussions similarly about fossil fuel subsidies, which are mostly about the environment and not so much about trade. There's an informal dialogue on plastics and so on. And so there's a much greater informal integration of trade and sustainability. And I think there will be more formal integration. So what kind of integration might we see? I think we'll see regulatory cooperation, integrated cross-functional lawmaking. And here I would applaud the European Union CBAM as an initiative, but as an initiative that demands a response from other countries and demands negotiation. So it prompts negotiations. I think in the trade area, unilateralism is often a prompt to multilateralism. And I hope that we'll see greater multilateral action in response to the European Union's CBAM. So we'll see cross-functional linkage and at the institutional level. Dr. Papa spoke about new organizations. I think we need more integrated organizations, trade ministers for climate change, but also integrated mandates, where it's recognized that this organization does indeed deal with climate change. We've had modest linkage, I would say, in preferential trade agreements, in mini WTOs. And as far as I can tell, the United Nations doesn't do much in terms of linkage among its different agencies, in terms of coordination among its different agencies. And then the other thing that's missing, as Andy described, is the need to take care of sustainable development while you're achieving greater sustainability, and the need to work out arrangements for developing countries. And there are starts to this. There's aid for trade, there's climate finance, there are trade facilitation funds, investment facilitation negotiations, just energy transition partnerships. So there are some things, but they're small and they're not well funded. It's something that needs to be expanded. So I think it's time to develop a comprehensive agenda. And I wanted to close by just telling you very briefly about a project that Dean Kite has led that I've been involved in with colleagues at Yale University and University of the West Indies. And it's called the Remaking Trade for Sustainable Development Project. And the idea is to, through a process of 10 workshops, and Andy joined us in Barbados 10 days ago for one of the workshops, in this process of 10 workshops with 50 white papers, what we're trying to do is develop a progressive consensus on what it would mean to make the trade system more supportive, harnessed to sustainability. And the topics are climate, digital commerce, engaging the global south, the circular economy, just energy transition. That was the Barbados one in Bridgetown, where Prime Minister Motley kicked off our discussions. Transportation, agriculture, oceans and the blue economy, social dimensions, including labor, poverty, health, gender, and indigenous rights. And then my personal favorite, which we haven't quite scheduled yet, is negotiations, institutional and legal structures, how to organize this for better negotiations and more effective organizations, as we've been saying. So we're working on that. We'll conclude our work, I think, by September and present it at the WTO Public Forum, and then try to get support for it in different governments. And I think just to say what I hope comes out of it, especially in the organizational part, is a kind of silo bridging diplomacy and silo bridging leadership. And because as I said, I think what we need is multifunctional diplomacy. We need member states to bring together their governments for all of government negotiations to deal with these linked issues. And then we need organizations that are also capable to transcend their traditional mandates and deal with these linked issues. So I think it's a tough problem. I've been trying to read the business literature about silo bridging and also about different kinds of matrix management, trying to understand what is this, how is it done in good organizations? Not to say the multilateral system isn't a good organization, but I think we've got some progress to make. So with that, I want to stop and open up to your questions and comments. I know that Andy said he had some questions, so maybe I'll just provide a lightning round of panel comments or questions, maybe in the order that we went at first. So Minister Haavisto, would you like to raise some questions or additional comments?
No, thank you. All this what has been said has been extremely interesting, and thanks, Joel, for those very good, I would say, concluding remarks on the panel as well, and good points. You mentioned the financial ministers for climate, and Finland was one of the initiators and is chairing that group, and it has been really growing and growing and growing. I think we had 60, 70 finance ministers now on board on this climate coalition, and it's really a change maker into thinking, as you rightly said. One issue that I've been thinking a lot, and I just share it with you, which is a European thinking of the strategic autonomy. You know, it was earlier actually describing the link between US and Europe, and I would say that countries like France were always thinking in the terms of defense and the NATO, and is there a European NATO and so forth. And whenever you still mention the strategic autonomy in Europe, you think about this US-Europe link. But actually now we are using the very same words on our dependencies with China. And this confuses me a little bit, because when we say strategic autonomy vis-a-vis United States, yes, we understand there can be a new kind of regime or leadership in the United States. We have to get along with our own resources in Europe, including the defense, maybe one day, but still the transatlantic links are very, very deep. And it's a history, and it has been deep. Even during the previous Trump administration, the military cooperation was active and so forth. And when you speak about the strategic autonomy vis-a-vis China, we speak about all our experiences during the COVID crisis, when we noticed that we don't produce any more protective equipment, and we are depending on China, or we can imagine many issues if we do the decoupling with China. I know that there are some people in Finland who says that we have to do the same as we did with Russia, and when I'm saying that, okay, if you do the decoupling with China, you don't have these microphones at the table, you don't have the computers at the table, so it's a different story if you think about that. but I think we have to be very clear on what kind of strategic autonomy we are speaking about. I think reducing the dependencies is very, very important when we look at the Chinese development. And then I maybe share with another question mark in which is now in European debate, is that what do we do with countries who vote wrongly in the UN, voting on Ukraine-Russia issue? We have more than 140 countries on board, but also with those countries who voted empty or who abstained or who voted against. Some of our European partners, including Finland, we still have development cooperation. And now we have increased tendency that, hey, we should cut the ties with these countries who are behaving wrongly and who support Russia and so forth. And I'm thinking in my mind, where is this leading to? And also in the development cooperation, we very often think that we are giving to the poorest people in the most remote areas. This might be also opposition supporters in those countries, not necessarily government supporters. How do we handle the situation? And it includes big countries like Ethiopia, for example. And we have this question mark, how do we deal with this kind of challenge in the international community? I will finish here.
Andy?
Thank you, Jill. Couple of things I would point out. The minister mentioned on how the private sector, in terms of the renewables, was asking for a hands-off, right? But the perspective on developing countries is that we actually need a lot of state intervention, because the cost of capital in many of our developing countries is too high because of sovereign risk, because of macroeconomic instability. Then the private investment that is needed to be able to carry out the energy transitions that we'll be discussing will not be channeled to those countries if we're not able to get the state to intervene. And we're talking about countries which are highly indebted. And the issue of debt, which was one of the discussions that we had very, very broadly at the workshop that Joel mentioned, with where we had the participation of the Prime Minister Motley of Barbados and the Bridgetown Initiative discussion. It is critical that we find ways of supporting those countries that today, comparing it to 10 years ago, there are over 60 countries that are spending more in the expenditures for their public debt than they're spending on healthcare. There's almost more than 20 countries that are spending more on their public debt service than on education. So if we're talking about just transition, going back to that, and the need for not leaving anyone behind, we definitely need to talk about how the multilaterals, how the development banks are also restructuring themselves to be able to support the countries that are highly indebted, but that the world depends on if we want to decarbonize. So that's one point. The other is around the Coalition of Trade Ministers for Climate. I'm really glad that Joel brought that up, because I think this is an example of the value that this place, that Fletcher has to the world. And it's about interdisciplinary thinking. And for everyone in this room, this might sound obvious, but it's not obvious out there. The discussions that we had, well, for example, when I was a Minister of Trade, and we had discussions around COVID vaccines and intellectual property at the WTO, when we brought the discussion of creating a CTAP, which was led by Professor here, Carlos Alvarado, former president of Costa Rica, around pooling intellectual property for vaccine development, it was very hard conversations at the WTO when all the discussions were around intellectual property and the economics of innovation. But what about health as a human right? And what about the social determinants of health? This breaking of silos is needed to happen in academia. So when people are going into decision-making, are able to talk across boundaries, across circles. And that is something that I really appreciate from my education here, just highlighting the value of interdisciplinary thinking. Then finally, when we're talking about the response from other countries for initiatives such as the Inflation Reduction Act or the Green New Deal, has to do with this potential race to the bottom. In what sense? Some countries are already talking about putting export bans, putting trade barriers, either to protect their own supply chains from the lower cost production that will be made in the US, or they recognize that the minerals, the materials that they have in their own countries are needed by the global powers, this might lead to inefficiencies. So that is something that we have to take into account, that could be one response. On the other hand, this deglobalization effect is seen on trade also on the rise of plurilateral agreements. And Costa Rica, we were part of the agreement on climate change, trade and sustainability, which is an initiative led by 6 small countries, Norway, Iceland, Fiji, Switzerland, New Zealand, and Costa Rica. We're trying to precisely do some of the things that Joel highlighted that are being discussed at the WTO, but has shown very, very slow progress. I mean, eco-labeling, goods and environmental services, and phasing out of fossil fuels. And the idea of having a plurilateral agreement like the ACCTS is that this small group of small countries are showing the way that you can use trade as a tool for sustainable development. That's the key. Obviously, the challenge is how do we get bigger countries, bigger economies to be part of such an ambitious initiative? That's the things that we're wrestling with, but at least we're showcasing that countries who are middle income, who are highly developed, can work together to try to create the conditions in which trade is just one tool that allows this energy transition to happen. I'll leave it there.
Mihaela?
So I wanted to follow up on 2 points. One is the point of interlinkages. And from looking at environmental and trade communities, they have over the past, let's say, 15 years, come much, much closer, more closely together. So in terms of both thinking about like sharing expertise, thinking about visiting each other's general platforms. But when we are asking like how to break silos, the question is, what is the anchor institution? Or shall we even have an anchor institution? And when we look at especially the perspectives from the BRICS countries, from developing countries, the very idea of thinking about climate change outside the UNFCCC has not been received well, because once you move out of the UNFCCC, the norms are different. And then the challenge is, how do you preserve the majority buy-in if you want to move climate, or if you want to interlink climate in a way that it's not deeply embedded in the original norms and values that the UNFCCC comprises. Of course, there's a question of orchestration and how that can be developed. On another point, the question of the UN and the UN voting and where countries actually fall, and I think some call them fence sitters. This question is particularly problematic, not because of each individual vote. What's problematic is that UN used to be a place where if everybody was arguing, you could go to the UN and you could talk, and then there was UN Secretary General over decades developed the good offices. But what happened to this time around, the UN Secretary General has not been able to use good offices because, of course, UN Secretary General was very clear on what side kind of he sees the who is right and who is wrong. So if the UN Secretary General cannot use good offices, then basically we rely on other countries engaging Russia to get Russia to the table if we are engaging in peacemaking or peace building. So when you look at BRICS discourses, you actually see that China is the one saying like, yes, eventually Russia will need to be socialized, Russia will need to be talked to. And if there is nobody who will talk to Russia, how will everything end? So in terms of the diplomatic space and who is actually the one who can still bring the parties to the table if mediation is attempted, then, or of course, if this becomes a legal case, that's a different story, then we are in a different bucket. But as long as good offices are still a valuable tool, then the question is who is the one to provide them? And if not UN, then who? So.
Thank you. Well, I want to open up to questions. We have microphones on both sides of the room. And if you have a brief comment or a question, I'd invite you to stand up and please. Yes, I'm sorry. Well, if you want to be heard.
Hello, I'm Claire Mondouz from Europe, in fact. But I wanted to say that I am a little puzzled, but maybe I didn't hear all the conference, so that's maybe the problem. But talking of deglobalization, you still seems to say that the multilateral setup system can still work, like the UN, like the WTO, and so on. But what we are observing today, that WTO institution is rather blocked because, for example, there is no more dispute mechanism. It was blocked by Trump, and a lot of dispute cannot be treated. So the whole WTO for the time being cannot respond anymore to what it was doing before and to new challenges that have not been yet experienced. The same for UN. UN is a very important achievement, of course, but today, UN and the Security Committee of UN is blocked because the Security Council, it's called, it's because it's done by the countries which were the bigger country, the country which, I would say, gained the war, plus China and Russia. And of course, that doesn't work again because it is not representative anymore of the world. There is no country of Africa. There is no, permanent representation of African countries. There is not a serious representation of Europe as such. There is Germany and France and North England, sorry. But it's still not responding to the big challenges of the global world today. And so I was thinking whether if we have to rethink this multilateral system and integrating the objective of sustainable development, of course, should we not see that first in the fact that we are seeing regional, we have to agree that some continental region, I would say as Africa or in Asia or in Latin America, have to even strengthen their integration process, develop more in a sustainable way, which takes account of all the integration of the continent at the level of the continent, and integrating that in a way that if you want to have a sustainable development, you need also to have an economic paradigm shift where your growth is not the only indicator of what we want to do in terms of sustainable development. So for me, we really have to rethink the world, even if we had to think it geopolitically now, because with the Ukraine war and so on, it makes sense for me to have Europe, strengthening and trying to find responses at this bigger Europe and issues, but we have to have Africa. All the countries all the big countries of the world now are all trying to get the African minds and resources and so on and get that market. We say China is terrible, but we did the same, Europe did the same. So sorry, I was too long, but I think to find, I would say two things to find, I would say some solution in this new context, which is very unstable, is really to think of regional continental integration, better representation at the world level, and really develop sustainable first at the level of a continent, including a new economic paradigm.
Excellent, thank you. I think maybe we'll take another question or two before I ask the panel to respond. Other people, I know there are lots of ideas in this room. Well, as you're thinking, I'll maybe ask our panel to very, very briefly. Oh, yes, please go ahead.
Well, I don't have my question fully fleshed out, so let's see if I can articulate it more or less. So climate energy concerns are one policy area of concern among others in society, and where people's livelihoods, the economy, people who are not yet wealthy wanting to become wealthy, and people who are wealthy wanting to become more wealthy. There are times when a transition to green energy is not in conflict with those the desire for economic growth, but other times it is. So, and while some countries, especially maybe some small countries, can quote unquote more easily transition a larger proportion of their energy portfolio into green energy, the majority of the world still will need fossil fuels, possibly for quite a long time. I think it's maybe like a fanciful dream to think that we can go renewable everywhere anytime, any soon. So as policymakers who are working not just thinking about one issue, but thinking about how you can best serve society, how do you balance the interests of people and how do you, and in what context, how important is climate versus people's livelihoods in the short term? Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we have two excellent sets of questions, but I want to ask our panelists to be brief if they wish to respond. Let me start at the other end of the table. Andy?
Sure. Start with the last question. I think that's at the heart of the discussion on the just transition. In the end, like I mentioned initially, you can't ask every country to leapfrog from their oil dependence to renewables because of infrastructure, because of their growing patterns of population, because of the needs to have some stability in the energy that is needed to carry out the development and the creation of good jobs. At the end of the day, it won't be politically feasible to do that because countries, as you rightly point out, and leaders in those countries are worried very much so about the socioeconomic conditions of their own people. That's why a lot of the discussions has been centered around loss and damage, around, well, who has contaminated, who has emitted the most, and why should countries who have not emitted have to stop their own possibilities of developing through the use of strategic ways of using fossil fuels or gas as transitions. There are other countries that can leapfrog. But again, I think when we're talking about what type of policies are debated at multilaterals and other places, it's the ideal would be to allow as much policy space as countries need to be able to carve their own paths. That obviously help them with their national determined contributions and their Paris Agreement goals, but at the same time that allows them the flexibility to, yes, maybe in the short term, increase the fossil fuel consumptions, but do it in a way that doesn't create stranded assets or locking in certain use of certain energy sources, but actually allows them to transition. So that's at the heart of that debate and a very complex one. And very quickly on the multilaterals, I think the WTO has shown that, yes, it has been stuck. Yes, there's no apple at Bali. That's particularly problematic for us small countries. But it has also shown that it's the place that is the organization that we have. We want to create a WTO today. It wouldn't be possible. But at least on the last ministerial, when there was some progress around subsidies for fisheries, you can see that, yes, some things still can be done at the forum, but I think that's exactly where Joel's and the Dean's initiative around reimagine the project of trade comes in, which is a very ambitious project to try to highlight and show a blueprint for how the WTO can transform itself, which is something that the Director General has already mentioned that it is on the agenda. But I think this series of workshops can provide a blueprint for how the WTO can transform and actually incorporate sustainability as at the core. But so far, very slow progress, not hope for many people. Yeah.
Thank you.
I think the important question about multilateralism is whether multilateralism works. I never look at multilateralism as only happening at the multilateral global level, but there is always like a parallel processing almost, where we see most of the parallel processing is with informal institutions, and informal institutions are exactly proliferating so that they can get the multilateral processes going. So the question is also like what issue needs to be resolved at what level, and that's always a political question. Usually, I mean, when we look at like UN Security Council and its rules, the idea was like, yes, things would go to the Security Council and they can't be figured out at the regional level. But so should there be some sort of subsidiarity at the global level where you figure out at what point the issues go up? That would be highly problematic because right now the region is no longer defined in geographical terms. And we can see it both through BRICS as trans-regional group where basically countries find their peers in not necessarily their neighbors. And also we can see that with Caribbean countries trying to integrate in African integrations and saying basically, you know, they are much more closely possibly peers in terms of development stage and aspiration and model rather than somebody else like Singapore. I think in terms of other concerns, an important question that we did not discuss is AI. So oftentimes we are in this bucket, either we talk about human environment relationship, so right now human climate, or we talk about human AI relationship. But if we are looking at points of pressure for humans and points of vulnerability, what we actually need to see is where human environment and AI overlap and where they put the greatest pressure together on human well-being. Thanks.
Thanks, excellent questions. So let me start with the UN. Whenever I visit New York, I get desperate. You know, the UN headquarters and the life there, and of course, Security Council and veto rights and all this. And you think that you want to reform everything. And whenever I'm looking UN in Sudan, UN in Yemen, UN in Afghanistan, I understand why this organization exists. People are doing excellent work, UNHCR, OCHA, UNICEF, all these organizations, then I start to believe to UN, back to UN again. And of course, now when looking to Security Council paralyzed on key issues because of Russia and China behavior, actually the General Assembly has now been taking the moral authority. This is organizationally a dilemma because General Assembly do not have the power and cannot mandate, of course, the Secretary General, but it's interesting that it works now like that, and still it works. So to say, it's make the best out of the situation, which is very desperate. But you are right on these regional organizations. African Union has seen better days, but it's still there. IGAD has seen better days, but it's still there. OSCE in Europe is paralyzed. We are suffering of that. But at the same time, I think this is not the end of multilateralism. We are living difficult times, and we have to probably keep these organizations because we cannot replace them. And it's rightly said, if you should today establish WTO or you should today establish UN, you couldn't do that. You couldn't get Iran and US at the same table and so forth. But in UN, it still exists. Another very short comment on the issue of climate and the values and so forth. I think, yes, people are looking for wealth. People are looking for decent lives. Environmental costs might be higher and so forth. But I think the mood, at least in Europe, is that actually the alternative costs of let things go on like this are very high for ordinary people. I mean, extreme weather conditions, flooding, rise of the sea levels, melting of the ice, all these issues are influencing to everyday life to people so much, not only in Europe, but when you look to African continent and the drought and those issues causing more famine and more problems, that you have to do something. Actually, the alternative costs are very high. So it's you cannot just choose the way to go on business as usual. Thank you.
I think this last point is a critical point, that the costs of failure are much higher than the reductions of wealth that have to be expended to to reduce climate change. But the question of who's going to pay and how they're going to pay is the critical question. And as I think all of our panelists have suggested, it's not right for the poorest to have to pay for this, and it has to be done. You know, I think it's interesting to think about the institutions that came out of the Second World War, the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations. They're old. Fletcher's old too, but we revitalize. And I think those organizations need to be revitalized. Our problems are new. Our global problems are quite different from the ones in 1948. And so we really need to rethink those, and it's hard to start to change. And I think we have institutions that are not fit for purpose at this moment, but I think it's important to identify the ways in which they are not fit for purpose, identify ways to negotiate for changes in this constitutional moment where we recognize the need to change, and start to get about the work. There was one more question, and then I think we'll need to close.
Virginia Holmes, Fletcher class of '88. So in a world in which there's a limited amount of sun energy hitting the earth, so that's limited energy resources, I understand that in some venues in Europe, a concept called degrowth has started being discussed, and the whole question being, how do you achieve prosperity or maintain prosperity in conditions of pursuing degrowth? But I've never heard any major figures in the USA discussing degrowth, certainly not politicians. People seem to be wedded to this linkage between growth and prosperity. So I'm wondering if anybody has any thoughts about degrowth.
Well, I think for the moment, degrowth it's an interesting discussion to be had. In practical terms, it's very complex because, as we were mentioning before, there's still a lot of people that are in drastic need of energy and drastic need of improving their consumption levels to reach even go beyond just bare poverty levels. So how the crux of the degrowth movement is, how do we create a world in which we live within the planetary boundaries, but at the same time is able to provide more space for those to grow, to continue growing. But if you think about it from the decision makers and politicians, like asking their own people who might already be over consuming, let's say, to stop consuming, it would have to be framed in very different ways. And I think the debate is not there yet that allows it to be put into political action. There are some examples of some countries who have been moving towards a donut economics approach, at least I think in Europe. There are others who are prioritizing a well-being approach that doesn't prioritize growth per se, but it's very challenging. And I think we need those type of discussions that help balance the discussion. But I think for now, what we have is just some interesting examples. We'll see how we're able to incorporate some of those, at least the core concepts of living within planetary boundaries, into more policy space.
Interesting question, and I don't have a final answer. It's in Europe already discussed among the young people, among the academic people, and so forth. But let me share one thought that your question triggered in my mind, that it's about the China and Africa, which is one of the key issues, of course, which we have to debate, how the powers like China is influencing other continents, Latin America, Africa, and so forth. I was working for UN and EU in Sudan for years, and discussing with Sudanese who said that there's a very good offer from China for the development. And then I asked that, how are China approaching you? What is the lift speed for China to countries like Sudan? And they said, well, it was very clear. There were two elements. First, China said that if you have any problems with the population growth, everybody said during the 1970s that China cannot manage its population growth. That was the common opinion in the West. Look what we did. So if you have in Africa a population growth problem, we have an answer to that. That happened during the 70s. Then during the 90s, people said that you cannot grow economically. And look what we have done. We have this permanent 6-7% growth rate and so forth. So if you have any problems with economic growth here on the African continent, we have a solution. And now they say that we cannot cope with environmental problems, but we happen to have the cheapest solar panels and cheapest wind turbines. And also, if you want to invest on clean energy and so forth, we have a solution. And then all this you can do even without democratic structures. So that's our challenge. What we can offer, what is our choice, and what we recommend, and so forth. And I think we have to stop at that question, because otherwise we are losing. Otherwise we are losing the market. Otherwise we are losing the linkages. Otherwise we are losing the friendship.
So I think over the past, let's say 10, 15 years, there has been much more effort internationally to talk about consumption, not only to talk about consumption as part of the Sustainable Development Agenda, but to talk about actually measuring what would be luxury for those, because we are talking here in terms of haves in degrowth. We're talking about those who have and those who don't have. So, but if we're focusing on those who have, they have been really out of the larger Sustainable Development Agenda for a long time, but now they're front and center. And through climate diplomacy, we see all of the questions that come out in terms of equity. How do you measure equity? How do you measure who is meeting luxury emissions and who is meeting basic needs? So I think I see these discussions at the international level leading us toward understanding that better and addressing that better. I think also when we think about degrowth, we can't think only about humans. We also need to think about that we are sharing our ecosystem with animals. So let's say if water is scarce, then that water is scarce for humans and for animals. So it's not like only humans who are suffering. So so that's something, and there is like a greater emphasis on animal law right now in the UN. So I think that dimension also needs to be in if we want not to be egocentric, but more like ecosystem, environment centric. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you to this terrific panel for really illuminating these issues. I'm sure that we could spend a lot of time discussing these, but I hope we've kicked off your visit to Fletcher and given you some things to think about as you continue your weekend. Thank you very much.